Committee, are there more questions that we'll need a closed session for, or are we confident that we're? Okay, all right, we can do that. Okay. We'll have the staff come back in. Yeah, that was all me. There too. All right, so we were not able to finish our question session, so we will be going back into executive session for a short time. Vice Chair, do you have a motion for us?
Until what time?
So, does 5 minutes sound like, do you think your question will take long? All right, any other questions that we'll have? All right, so let's go with 5 minutes. I'm going by the clock on my laptop. I have 9:38. That'll put us at 9:43, let's say 9:44.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move the open meeting of the Joint Committee on Kansas Security be recessed for a closed executive meeting pursuant to KSA 754319A to discuss matters related to security measures that protect a public agency pursuant to KSA 754319B12C. Because discussion of such matters in an open meeting would jeopardize such security measures, that the committee resume the open meeting at 582 North of the State House at 9:44, and this motion, if adopted, be recorded in the minutes of the Joint Committee on Kansas Security and be maintained as part of the permanent records of the committee.
You heard the motion. Do I have a second? All in favor? All opposed? We are in closed session. Okay, you can finish your explanation now. We are back in open session.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And so Senator Peck, to the question of, we face this, for lack of a better term, mountain of fraud and litany of attacks on the system. And at the same time, the agency had challenges paying legitimate claimants who are eligible and entitled for benefits. Unfortunately, some of those delays are just a result or side effect of the fact that we had to fight fraud at the level we did. I think that's something that was extremely common across all 53 states and territories to a different degree. I know when I talk to my counterparts in other states, that's a lot of the same story is I had to do so much to fight fraud in the beginning until we got the tools in place that we needed to, that now I'm having to go through this cleanup. And unfortunately, it does impact those legitimate claimants. Something I spoke to earlier is that, we have processes in place to identify these individuals, to work them through the ID verification process, and we will work to make all of these claims right until it's all completed. The last component I'd add to this is when we talk about fraud, I think it's been challenging to clearly define what all encompasses fraud. Early on in the pandemic, the most prevalent version of that was imposter fraud or ID theft issues, right? Someone purchased my information off the dark web or obtained it somehow, used that to fraudulently file a claim in my name, and then collected those benefits. That was the most common and what we had to spend so much time fighting at the beginning of the pandemic. But what we also seen, what is mirrored from what we saw in the Great Recession, is that when there's a greater availability of benefits, other types of fraud and the more traditional fraud that the agencies fought increased as well. Examples of that are something like wage fraud. If I was a claimant claiming unemployment benefits each week, but I also had work that I wasn't reporting to the agency and receiving wages there, that's wage fraud. That's something that we've fought for decades at this point, and is what our traditional fraud team always did. Even though imposter fraud became the number one bucket throughout the pandemic and was the newest type of fraud, we still saw a substantial increase in wage fraud that requires investigation. So something the agency is working to better do is more clearly make sure that both legislators, businesses, other stakeholders, and claimants understand that fraud is much more complicated in many cases than just verifying someone's identity. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, and I appreciate your presentation today. There's good information there, and it sounds like we're making progress. I would like to commend the two folks that you have working with us when we have constituents call in and what have you. They've done a fantastic job. Julie Mangini and Jessica Dragoo have both been famous. I mean, we talk about them often and how effective they've been, so we appreciate them. And thank you for your presentation today.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, committee.
Okay, that's it for our closed sessions, I believe. As something comes up, our next presentation is going to be from the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. I see the director and Robert Jacobs are both here. So if you'd like to come up. While they get their presentation set up, how you doing?
All right. Good morning, members of the committee. I think we'll be putting a PowerPoint up here for you, but just preliminary matters. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with the committee today and talk about some of the things that are concerning to us, some of the issues that we're seeing now, and what we think we might be seeing in the future. I hope we're focused on those things which the committee is interested in, but in case we miss the mark a little bit there, please be aware we'd be happy to take questions on any matter of security. If we don't have an answer for you today, we will definitely get it for you and come back to this body. But our executive officer, Robert Jacobs, will be making the presentation today. And again, we will stand for questions when this is completed. And please let us know if there's anything you need from us.
Very good. Thank you, sir.
Good morning. I'm going to try and get this set up real quick for you. I believe there's, hopefully this will work. Slide this down. So, let's see if we can, I think someone might be coming out to help us. Oh, maybe, there we go. I think we got it, maybe. Yes. Okay. Good morning, Chairman Smith and members of the committee. My name is Robert Jacobs. I am the Executive Officer of the KBI. We appreciate the opportunity to come this morning in front of you and speak about the emerging threats to the state of Kansas and the crime trends that are affecting our state as well. As a reminder, our mission is to provide professional, investigative, laboratory, and and criminal justice information services to Kansas criminal justice agencies in the hopes of purpose of promoting public safety and preventing crime. Today, got to stand it closer. This morning, I'd like to go over several areas. You can kind of see them up there regarding the threats that are affecting the state of Kansas. Specifically, we'll talk about violent crime. That is a obvious concern to our state. Crimes against children continue within our state, and I think it's important to speak to that. The illicit narcotics that are going through our state, we will discuss, and the impact that that is having on Kansas. One of the bigger issues, as you've heard multiple times today, probably and yesterday, is cybersecurity. The threats to cybersecurity within Kansas, both to our state government and to our individuals, is a constant concern. And then finally, we'll also talk about a little bit on civil unrest, some of the things that we've observed around the country over the past year, and how that is impacting Kansas, and what we are doing to kind of debate that or identify that and deal with it. Further, finally, or one of the last ones that we'll discuss for threats are property crimes, and specifically the rise in catalytic converter thefts. That is an issue that is plaguing many of our larger communities, and so we'll discuss that. This committee asked us to also present some information on license plate readers, so we want to make sure and offer some comments on that and give you some thoughts on the use of license plate readers and the data that goes along with that. And finally, we will discuss recruitment in law enforcement and public safety, and how that is impacting public safety in general, and impacting our field and our ability to provide that public safety. Okay, sorry. Thank you. So first, I'd like to start by talking a little bit about some national data. Every year, the Federal Bureau of Investigation creates what's called their Uniform Crime Report. This is a collection of crime data from all across the country. The FBI divides this into violent crime and property crime. Violent crime is consists of murder or homicides, and to include murder and non-negligent manslaughter, rape, robbery, and aggravated assaults. Property crime includes burglary, theft, and larceny, and then motor vehicle theft and arson. So some of the data that came out of the Uniform Crime Report this year included this statistic that on average across the country, a violent crime occurred about every 24.7 seconds, and a property crime occurred every 4.9 seconds. This is kind of alarming if you think about how quickly that amount of time, and especially when we talk about the violent crime. This was a year that saw many people staying home, and yet our violent crime went up. Overall, from a national standpoint, the violent crime overall crime did decline by 6%. However, our violent crime did go up. There's different theories behind why that occurred. Some think it could be due to pandemic stress. It could be to some of the observations with the George Floyd murder and what occurred there. And so it's difficult to pinpoint one exact thing that caused this, but we did notice on a national level that violent crime did go up, specifically homicide crimes, and they went up 29% comparatively to last year. And so that is a concern. It's unfortunately a concern that we will also see on a Kansas level too, which we'll talk about here in a minute. One of the things also that we discussed, or that was mentioned in the Uniform Crime Report, is the number of crimes and specifically murders that occur due to gun violence. That number was 77% of homicides were due to gun violence, which is the highest it's ever been since they started recording that. Again, there's speculation as to why that may be occurring. Some folks think that it's tied to drug trade and things like that. But again, it's difficult to pinpoint one exact reason. We'll talk a little bit more about some strategies to combat that here in a minute. So in Kansas, much like the Uniform Crime Report, we also collect data on crime. The KBI uses the Kansas Incident-Based Reporting System to collect data on both violent and property crime in Kansas as well. That data is collected, and then there's an annual report that is completed and published from the KBI regarding that, the Kansas Index Crime Report. So as you can see, in 2020, violent crime also went up in Kansas. It went up 24.4% over the year. And also the murder rate also went up. The issue I want to point out here with the murder rate is that the murder rate increased 48.5%, which is 1.5 times the national average, that increase. And so there's definitely some things we need to look at for the state of Kansas. And overall, violent crime went up. The majority of that violent crime occurred due to increases in aggravated assault, because aggravated assault was 81% of all the violent crime that occurred in Kansas. That that murder rate, again, we didn't have any correlation to the number of gun violence, particularly to that. We can get that for you if that's something you're interested in. But the jump in violent crime is obviously a concern to public safety.
Yeah. We need you to use your microphone, Senator.
We used a closed session now. No, I'm kidding. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Could you explain aggravated assault and the significance of the 81% and why you brought that up as a factor here? What do we derive from that in terms of this trend?
Well, the reason I put that in there was primarily because to show that although our violent crime, our homicide rate increased quite a bit, actually the majority of violent crimes that are occurring in Kansas are actually aggravated assault. And that's what's driving that number, the whole violent crime number up, versus just the murder rate. Aggravated assault is battery and anything that would constitute an injury. And then it's one of the most common types of violent crimes. And so that's that number that was driven up. Here's a graph I wanted to show, just to show you the homicide rates over Kansas over the last several years from 2011 on up. And you can see that the number has fluctuated. Between 2014 and 2017, it consistently was rising. However, in 2017, it started to go down in 2018 and 2019. But then again, we see that sharp increase over this last year, from 130 murders in 2019 to 193 murders in 2020. That's that 48% jump. And so that's a concern to the safety of our citizens. So in one effort to try and combat violent crime in Kansas, I wanted to draw attention to a specific operation that a law enforcement undertook in June and July of this year. It was called Operation Triple Beam. This operation was a collaborative effort between federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies. It was focused on the south central part of Kansas, specifically the Sedgwick County area, but it looked at identifying and targeting violent crime offenders specifically. The goal in this operation was to identify these individuals and to get them off of the streets, and also specifically the firearms off the streets, because those were some of the correlation there to the violent crime was the high number of gun violence. So they went through this. They used crime analysis to try and identify these individuals. The federal marshals were involved in this, and Kansas Department of Corrections, several other groups were involved in this group. So I put on here surge capacity, and you'll hear me discuss that a couple of times this morning, because one of the things that we really look for with our agency is the ability to provide additional resources and manpower to operations and situations exactly like this, where the local agencies are requesting our help and we have that ability to send that. One of the things that we'll talk about here in a little bit at the end of the presentation is our deficiency in our ability to provide that surge capacity. And this is one example of how an operation where we needed surge capacity to do that. As a kind of an overall, I wanted to tell you about the results of Operation Triple Beam. As I said, it was a 60-day effort. It resulted in over 1,000 arrests. About 221 firearms were seized. You can see the amount of ammunition that was taken off of the streets. And then along with that, when we talk about violent crime and especially when we talk about drug crime, there was narcotics and U.S. currency or cash that was also seized in this operation. It was a very successful operation, and again, to kind of summarize, it was just one aspect of what law enforcement is trying to do to combat violent crime in Kansas, and specifically gun violence. So, when we talk about gun violence, there was a presentation or a statement that was prepared for the United States Senate Senate Committee on Judiciary by Chief Art Acevedo. I hope I'm not mispronouncing this. Acevedo. He is the Houston PD Chief of Police, and he also is the president of the major cities police associations. And so he prepared a statement to the committee, and in this he specifically talks about the rising level of gun violence. And he came up with some recommendations that his association believes would benefit at fighting the rising level of gun violence. And some of those include improvements to universal background checks. So when we talk about when people sell firearms, whether it's at a gun show or elsewhere, making sure that we're having those background checks completed. The strengthening of the FBI National Criminal Background Check, which is the NICS system. The KBI operates the NICS system, and we need to strengthen that. There are a few different ways that we can do that. And then also, he encouraged the aggressive prosecution of those individuals that are purchasing firearms for people who are prohibited to have firearms. So really what we're trying to get at, we're not trying to say we need to get rid of firearms. What we're trying to do is make sure that we get rid of the people, or we prohibit the people who cannot have firearms and are illegally using those firearms. That last point, those are called straw purchases, and those are done and they are prosecuted at both the state and federal level. He believes, and I think it's not a bad idea, that we get much more assertive with those prosecutions. The key is to keep these firearms out of people who have criminal backgrounds and have a propensity to use violence and use firearms in that way. So I'd like to turn a little bit and talk about sexual assault in Kansas. There are obviously still way too many sexual assaults that are occurring in our state. And a continued effort needs to go on with the fight to combat that and to address sexual assault in our state. But I guess one small positive news from the statistics are that that sexual assault and specifically rape, the number of reported rapes went down in 2020. So it went down by 8.2% from last year. There were 1,190 rapes reported in Kansas. The good news is that in again another effort to try and fight sexual assault in Kansas and identify those individuals who are serial sex offenders. The KBI, as many of you are aware of, started a program several years ago that's called the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative, SAKI. And the SAKI effort was to identify untested sexual assault kits that remained throughout the state. When we started that program, we identified these in assistance with local law enforcement, in collaboration with local law enforcement. Those kits were brought into the KBI and to Johnson County and Sedgwick County, their laboratories, to start working those kits and getting them tested. Those results were run through our CODIS system to identify offenders who may be associated with other criminal cases or just may have an association within CODIS. So the good news is that in 2021, we actually completed all SAKI testing. There were over 2,000, I believe 2,200 kits that were sent in the SAKI project. And all of those kits have been now tested. The reports have been completed and those have been forwarded back to the local law enforcement. But again, this effort needs to continue. We need to make sure that those kits continue to come into the laboratories. And as such, many of you may remember last year, the KBI supported the proposal of House Bill 2228. This was a bill that was introduced to have law enforcement, required law enforcement to adopt a policy that would require them to submit kits to the KBI or to a forensic laboratory in Kansas within 30 days. Those kits would have to be tested then, which is the second part of the bill. One of the other things that we looked at with sexual assault kits and the problems and the sexual assault kit collection, or the evidence collection, was the availability of that type of collection to be done specifically on children. Sometimes the setting for collecting that evidence from children is not the most conducive in a hospital. So we tried to put a provision in this new bill that would allow evidence collection to be done at child advocacy centers with trained people still at child advocacy centers around the state. This would allow better proximity to many people to get this evidence collected, but the big thing is to promote the collection of the evidence and then the submission and testing of that evidence.
Senator Pittman?
Thank you. I'm just struck that we would, I mean, it seems remarkable that we would have to put this in statute that, and I fully support what I'm hearing here. I don't think I'd heard this one before. How is it that we are not doing this across the state? How are we not getting these kits and these tests done within 30 days? I don't understand how that's even feasible. I mean, it just seems incredible to me that we wouldn't be doing that, and we would have to put a law in place to have that happen. How's that happening? Can you help me just understand that? It's just so striking.
Absolutely, and I appreciate that question. To answer it, for the most part, we are. Law enforcement is submitting those kits almost across the board. I would be remiss if I said 100% because I don't have those numbers. However, the real emphasis behind this was not so much to correct that or to try and fix that issue, because it was already being done. The reason for this legislation, because it is within national best practices to do that, to make sure that we have some sort of statute that requires law enforcement to submit these kits. But it's not just about the law enforcement. It's also about our testing of it. And then also, as I said, the CAC piece. And then the final piece to it that I hadn't mentioned yet is also one of the things also within national best practices is that in Kansas, when we looked at anonymous kits, those are kits that a victim or of a sexual assault can go to a hospital if he or she would like to, and then have that evidence collected. They're not required to notify law enforcement of that assault. However, that kit is still collected. It is sent to the KBI where it remains untested for 5 years. And if at some point in those 5 years that victim decides that he or she does want to present or make a police report and move through the criminal justice system, they have that option to do that. And then we will pull that kit and start testing it, and the process would continue. The problem is that when we created that anonymous kit or anonymous option, the statute of limitations in Kansas was 5 years for rape. It's now gone. There is no statute of limitations. So looking at best practices around the country and the recommendations from other SACI groups that are working around the country, it was decided that you should extend that time of retention of keeping those kits from 5 years to, well, for us, from 5 years to at the minimum 20 years or until the statute of limitations runs, whichever is the shorter of those two. And so we don't really have, again, a statute of limitations. So part of House Bill 2228 will be to extend the amount of time the KBI retains those sexual assault kits from 5 years to 20 years. And so part of that obviously is all put into that bill. We do want to, we do have a very good working relationship with law enforcement around the state, and they are submitting those kits. And so we just want to make sure that we're within national best practices. So, and so that, just to kind of sum up that little section, the House Bill 2228 passed the House last session. It is currently sitting in the Senate Judiciary Committee, and we hope to get a hearing early on in the session in 2022. So I'd like to turn our attention a little bit to crimes against children. We mentioned this earlier, that they're still going up, unfortunately, and there's still an issue with crimes against children. If any of you know the website or the organization RAIN, it stands for Rape, Abuse, and Incest, the national network for them. They published a statistic that said on average a child protective services investigator substantiates a claim of child abuse or child sexual abuse every 9 minutes. That's pretty horrific, unfortunately. So what we're seeing in Kansas is that oftentimes our child protective services are overwhelmed. They have large caseloads. They have time constraints, I believe, and so we want to try and work to try and alleviate some of that and help with that. Many of these child protective services individuals also have, there's a training out there called forensic interviewing for children, which is a specific type of interview that you do with children, especially in investigative situations or criminal situations. So some of these Child Protective Services personnel have this training, but many do not. And so we think it would be a good idea to start collaborating with DCF, law enforcement's collaboration with DCF, which is occurring to some extent around the state. But we need to enhance that. And so that's our recommendation. The State Child Death Review Board, every year over the past several years, has made that same recommendation that that law enforcement works collaboratively with DCF workers to try and identify these individuals and identify these cases that are falling through the cracks. And in 2021, the State Death Review Board also issued a recommendation that the DCF and law enforcement create a best practices approach to the investigation of child abuse and child neglect. And that's what I think is creating that best practices is the first step, but obviously we need to implement that and use that as well. So we'll talk here in a minute about some proposals that the KBI has to try and help with that. But that is definitely, I think, an area that we need to address is our child abuse and neglect kids that are not only in the system, but also just within our communities. This is a significant issue, and it's one that falls within the KBI's priorities, investigative priorities. And as such, we have dedicated 4 specific focus areas to crimes against children. Those focus areas are Northeast. We have a Northeast Child Victims Task Force that operates right here in Topeka. We have a child victims unit and people that are specially trained in forensic interviewing like that spread throughout the state. We have been working a Catholic clergy task force for the past 2 or 3 years. And this final one, major violent crimes and crimes against children, we'll get back to that proposal that I mentioned a minute ago with working with DCF. So we'll talk about that here in a minute. The Northeast Child Victims Task Force is a task force that's based, as I said, here in Topeka. It's a collaborative effort with the KBI, the Attorney General's Office, and Topeka Police Department. They have 7 task force members. It was established through legislative support, as you can see. They've been operating now for about 3 years and have been, the first year we were getting people on board, but they've been operating pretty successfully over the last 2 years, definitely. In 2021, you can see some of the cases that they've worked, about 42 cases with 9 arrests, 11 convictions, and 27 forensic interviews. This number may have been a little lower due to the COVID-19 and the ability to make contact with kids, but for the most part, they've been operating pretty much steadily as they were in the past. The real big number, I think, here is the 146 search warrants served. These are both search warrants on computers and phones, but also in actual physical search warrants served on people's residence. They identify these cases in the Northeast region. And really, I think that the important thing to know with this task force is it's been very successful and that the KBI intends to duplicate this effort in other parts of the state. We want to see these task forces in other areas of Kansas, and we will be, in the upcoming years, that's what we're going to be seeking to do. Our Child Victims Unit is, as I mentioned, has people that are trained specifically in crimes against children. They are dedicated to work those particular cases. They have that additional training on forensic interviewing of children. Unfortunately, we had a lot of requests for help with crimes against children all across the state. And we have a very limited resource in manpower to be able to work these cases. So for that reason, unfortunately, we're only able to work cases that fall under the Jessica law statute. So these cases are predominantly are focused on kids that are younger than 14 years old as victims, and they are they're difficult cases to work. They also, in the same sense, have much more stringent penalties for them. The minimum prison sentence is usually 25 years and oftentimes goes up to 40 years. So these cases are significant. They are truly, as I mentioned, difficult cases to work and often have multiple victims when we're talking about these perpetrators. So right now, our CVU unit is focused only on Jessica law cases. But again, that kind of goes back to our capacity and our ability to respond to these and grow in our area of dealing with crimes against children. Our Catholic Clergy Task Force was established in 2019 in coordination with the Kansas Attorney General's Office. There are 4 Catholic dioceses in Kansas. Those are in Kansas City, Salina, Wichita, and Dodge City. There's a 5th one that is affiliated with the Catholic Church, many of you may be aware of. It's called the Society of St. Pius X. It's in St. Mary's, Kansas. This task force was built based on calls that were coming in regarding abuse related to the Catholic Church and the diocese. And so this is not new to Kansas. I mean, they're unique to Kansas. These were happening all over the country. But Kansas tried to look at and again, identify a group of individuals that could go out and specifically address this issue. Once again, getting back to that surge capacity that we have at the KBI, or that we need. Since the inception of the task force, we have received, we set up a crime line, a phone line that people could call in to report claims of sexual abuse or physical abuse. And then also we established an email address that people could do that through. So since the inception, we've received 215 tips to those 2 lines. Of those, we've worked through those and did our due diligence, and we've opened 122 investigations related to that. And then working with these dioceses, which the KBI task force has been doing, to get records and look through those records for past claims or past contacts. They've reviewed almost 40,000 diocesan records in that time. So they really are interested in not only looking at whether or not there was a claim made, whether it was to the diocese itself or to law enforcement, but also how that went through and what the follow-through was on that claim when it was initially made. So that's what that group is doing. That group continues to work. I believe that there'll be a report coming out when they're completed with their work.
Senator Pittman.
You know, on the Northeast Task Force, we had a number of really solid numbers of search warrants and I guess convictions, and that was only in 2 years. Why, with 40,000 different records, doesn't seem to be any action on this side? Is the pursuit not revealing anything? I mean, it seems like there's a lot in the news about this. What's the story there? Why are there harder numbers on that other one and not on this one?
Good question. I think that part of it has to do with time. Obviously, we run into time constraints with how far back these complaints or these incidents occurred. I couldn't give you an answer as to why what the obstacles are for pursuing convictions and prosecutions. I'm happy to work on that and get that for you. That's not a problem. Okay. All right. Thank you, Senator Pittman.
Representative Ruiz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Were you aware that this year we passed a law called Adrian's Act, Adrian's Law, that requires DCF and law enforcement to accompany when there's reports of abuse and neglect for children?
Yes, sir.
And it took effect in June. So how would that prepare you all for just what you're talking about?
That's a great point. Yes, Adrian's Law did pass, and it has law enforcement, and I believe it had something to do with also visually inspecting that child with claims of abuse. I think that, again, those are great efforts to promote the collaborative work between DCF and law enforcement. In this next slide, you're going to see our suggested approach to that, but that is something that is the first step. We think that those two entities need to work together, and I think that having that hands-on and also, or those eyes-on, I guess is the better way to say that, with those children to make sure that to be able to validate that abuse and claim and also get that help to them as quickly as possible. So I do believe it is beneficial. So finally, getting right to that, our last initiative is, or that we would like to see done, is the major violent crimes and crimes against children. In 2020 legislative session, the KBI brought forth an enhancement request to receive additional funding that would be paid or would be used for supplementing and increasing the capacity of our investigations unit. That group, those additional agents would be assigned specifically to this crimes against children group. And the plan behind that is a collaborative effort with DCF. We would put special agents in DCF offices working directly with the DCF workers to identify those cases that are criminal in nature and move that process through quicker so that that a thorough and professional investigation can be done of those criminal acts, if those claims of criminal acts. And so we do believe that still is a priority for us. We did not seek that similar, again, it did not pass or did not get enhancement funding in 2020. And we did not seek it in 2021, primarily due to what we believed was the fiscal state of the state and our concerns for some of where our budget was going to be. However, it still remains on our priority list. We do want to see that done. Initially, we had plans to divide this up into basically two halves of the state and request funding to get money for people to be to fill like the western side and then the eastern side. I think that we've divided that even into 3 sections now, so to make it easier to secure that funding, to be honest with you. But it is still an important endeavor, and I think, and it's also supported by both our director and the DCF, Secretary of Department of Children and Families. So we would like to see that move forward and get that increased capacity to work and identify these criminal acts as quickly as we can. So, okay, let's talk a little bit about narcotics. So in Kansas, we have looked at the different statistics around what is occurring in Kansas. There's a group called the Midwest High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area. That's a group that looks at what drug activity is going on. It actually encompasses 6 different states. Kansas is one of those, though. And it issues an annual report that looks at threats related to drugs. And so in this year's report, one of the things that it noted was that obviously, or not obviously, but methamphetamine, opioids, and marijuana continue to be the 3 most easily or most accessible drugs in Kansas. And that specifically it talked about the amount of violence that goes along with the use, distribution, and transportation of narcotics. And so when we talk about threats to public safety, we have to talk about the violence that's associated, both property and violent crime that's associated with drug use and the drug trade. The HIDA group identified 770 different DTOs, drug trafficking organizations that are operating in the Midwest section. These are organizations that are complex, they are structured, they have a high level of control and command and control within their organization, and they are moving large quantities of narcotics at a time. Oftentimes multiple narcotics, not just one type, multiple different types. And so 770 of these operating throughout this region, not just Kansas, but this region.
Senator Pittman.
You sure you got that number right? 770 drug trafficking rings, basically, that are complex, or you're not talking about just like 4 individuals that are here. We're talking about significant DTOs operating in this region, 770 different operations that I think they've identified, knowing there could be more or less.
In 6 different states. And so not just Kansas, and that includes Chicago, that includes some other larger metropolitan areas too. And so that is the number that was reported, though.
Representative Baker.
Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is that number growing, or do you think you're starting to win that battle?
That's a good question. I don't. I can get you the number from last year and to see how many DTOs were operating in last year's report, and then and over maybe the last 5 years. I don't have that number off the top of my head, but I am happy to get that for you. I don't know if that number is growing. I know that the level of violence associated with drug trade is increasing, unfortunately. So, and they're becoming more sophisticated, which is really kind of what I was going to get to in my next point. Drug trafficking organizations are using technology to really help their business, and especially their drug shipments. They're using encrypted emails to communicate. They're using GPS devices to track their product as it moves across. They're using the dark web to communicate. And all of these things are being used, technology is being used to facilitate their business, whether that's payments for their product or any other type of thing that they do within their shipments. And so, I'm sorry.
So my point, I guess, is I'm old now. So I just had another birthday, and I remember clear back in the 1980s, the war on drugs we waged. Well, it doesn't sound like this war is going too well, does it?
It's certainly ongoing. It's hard to say whether we're winning it or not. I think the better question is the fight still valid? And I think it is. I think that these drugs and these illicit drugs, illegal drugs, are causing a lot of harm to the public, whether it's in overdoses, accidental overdoses, and specific types of drugs. If you look at fentanyl, for example, it's increasing. It's very dangerous. People don't know how to use it, and it's causing a lot of overdoses. And so we haven't seen the same fentanyl deaths here in Kansas that we've seen in other states. But I do think that there is an impact that drugs are having on public safety. And so I don't know how to answer your question as to whether the fight is being won or not. It's ongoing.
Well, the amount of dollars have certainly escalated. And whenever there's a lot of dollars, there's going to be more activity. We saw that back in the days of Prohibition, and we saw how that ended up. And now we've almost made alcohol like Pepsi Cola, and it looks like something that's going to have to be done here on the narcotics side also. Thank you.
Thank you. Specifically, turning to narcotics in Kansas and some of the things that we're seeing, HIDA did identify that the amount of transportation that is occurring and the violence that goes with transportation and distribution of narcotics is a threat and is increasing. The one thing that, if you look at Kansas, we have I-35 that goes through the middle of it. We've got I-70 that goes through across it horizontally. And you've got 335 that comes up from Dallas and Oklahoma City into Kansas City. I-29 is a highway that, although doesn't really get into Kansas, it skirts right along the outsides of Kansas on the Missouri side. And so the movement of narcotics in and around Kansas is significant. And again, what goes with that is the violence associated with it. And those narcotics are not only going through Kansas, they are coming into our communities, and we have to remember that. And so that's a concern. When we look at marijuana specifically, a lot of the marijuana that we saw in Kansas in the past was grown in Mexico and was brought up from Mexico. Now we're seeing that the marijuana here is mostly domestic born. It is grown and raised in the United States, oftentimes coming from states that have either legalized or decriminalized marijuana use. And so, and the issue with that is that particular marijuana has a very high THC count or content. And so it's much more potent, it's much more effective, and is concerning. If you look, going back to the highways that run through Kansas, if you look at the states around us, we have Colorado, which with recreational marijuana. It started with medicinal marijuana, and it's recreational marijuana now. Missouri has recreational marijuana, and Oklahoma has recreational marijuana. So that movement of marijuana in and around Kansas is occurring, and it's not just the legally grown marijuana. There's black market marijuana out there too. And again, when we deal with black market trade, we see violence. And so, getting back to the concern for public safety is the movement in general, is the movement of narcotics through Kansas. So cybersecurity is probably one of our biggest and most concerning threats to the state currently. I wouldn't want to say it's the only one, obviously, because we've talked about many others already. However, this is a concern. Cyber attacks on our infrastructure are a growing concern and are happening more frequently. Many of you may have seen in the news recently a cyber attack on Pottawatomie County and the systems that they have in Pottawatomie County. A similar attack occurred in Bourbon County. And that was an attack that involved a compromise of their email system. And so these individuals, these criminals are able to reach in, oftentimes from outside of Kansas, and compromise, touch, change, or attack our state systems and local systems. And a lot of those things that's valuable information to them. It contains a lot of personal information and information that they can utilize. And so, and we heard earlier, right before our presentation, on the amount of fraud that's going on. And we'll talk a little bit about that here in a minute. So one of the biggest concerns for the KBI on more personal and public safety side is our criminal justice information system. The ks.gov system is a system that is utilized by law enforcement, fire department, EMS, the courts, our fusion center, our prisons, a lot of different entities that use it. Any compromise to that would be detrimental to our public safety. And that system is utilized to keep our officers safe, to allow them to respond to emergencies. And it's very important to secure that system and make sure that it's safe. One of the things that the KBI has looked at is standing up a cybersecurity center, which would be manned by professional IT folks who are trained in cybersecurity mitigation. They would provide they would provide training and education to local and state public safety entities. The whole purpose of this is to identify threats to these entities and then try and mitigate those as quickly as possible. That group would work very much hand in hand with our cyber crimes investigations unit. We'll talk about them here in a minute. But it's important to remember that when we talk about cyber crimes and a cyber attack, that as we look at cyber attacks on the state and on the state infrastructure, we have IT people that can prevent that and can work to stop that, but those are still criminal acts, and we need to investigate those. And so our cyber crimes unit is designed to do that, and we'll talk about that here. One thing I do want to add, though, before we get to the cyber crimes unit, is an increasing or compounding problem that we have with cybersecurity. And that's seen here in the state and abroad and in other states as well. And that is the lack of IT security folks we have working for the state. We have a real concern for the amount of IT people that we're able to recruit, not only at the KBI, but within other agencies. And that it's hard to compete for those individuals and that level of knowledge and training and experience with federal agencies, the federal government, whether that's them or it's the private industry or it's the specific cybersecurity companies that specialize in that. There's a lot of factors that go into trying to get these individuals to work for us, and their work is crucial. There's a constant barrage of attacks on state systems, and having the people who are trained to do that, who can repel those attacks and mitigate them is incredibly important. This is a quote you saw out of the News and Observer that I found that talks about the issues with IT staff and professionals in state government. But ultimately, kind of as the last line says, I think it's really important that we understand the importance of building our capacity to fight the cyber attacks, because they aren't lessening, they are increasing, and they're getting better and better at what they do. And so we have to have people who are dedicated to preventing that. Earlier, you heard about the fraud that was going on last year with Department of Labor and many other departments of labors around the country. The FBI has a group that they look at. It's called a section called the Internet Crimes Complaint Center. They take complaints from the public on fraud and other types of crime that occurs over the internet. Last year, according to their report, they received over 800,000 different complaints of fraud. That was a record number, 69% increase from previous year. And I think that the one thing that's interesting to note about this is that they stated that many of those complaints, again, as you just heard, came from fraud that was associated with individuals targeting citizens and businesses for their relief money, stimulus money, unemployment benefits, things like that. And so not only did what you hear from Department of Labor ring true, we're seeing it on a national level as well, that it wasn't just in Kansas, but it is happening all over. So many of you may remember in 2020, the KBI, you helped fund an enhancement for the KBI to create the KBI Cyber Crimes Unit. That unit, last year you asked about that unit, and we were at that time still hiring folks, getting them trained, and bringing them up to speed on cybercrime investigation. Since then, I wanted to update you on some of the things that they've done. They have included and completed over 644 hours of advanced training in that last year. They have also began taking cases in October of 2020. And so they are currently accepting requests for assistance. And during the last year, what we have seen is that specifically, I wanted to give some examples. An attack on a school district here in Kansas for cybersecurity, a threat that was made to a public official via cybersecurity, or an elected official, I'm sorry. And so, and then we have two cases that involve monetary diversion. One was of a Kansas business where they diverted, through cyber criminals, diverted $600,000 from this business. And then another one was the loss of about $250,000 from an individual, from a Kansas individual. And those are the types of cases that this group is targeting and is identifying and aggressively working. Again, kind of going back to my previous point, these cases are criminal in nature. And when we hear a lot about cybersecurity and the need to protect our infrastructure and things like that, and that is incredibly important. But we also, there's a criminal investigation that needs to occur with that. And one of the most important things that that this group can do, whether it's the cybersecurity folks, cyber crimes folks that work for us, or our cybersecurity IT folks, is to make sure and educate the citizens of Kansas and the general population on education, how we can prevent these types of things from happening to us, whether they're scams or anything else, and the importance of reporting these things to law enforcement. That is incredibly important because many times people see an odd email or fall for a phishing scam or whatever it may be, and they don't report it to law enforcement. They just chalk it up to being naive or making that mistake and moving on. And you know, it's when they lose a lot of money, they tend to report it. But we need awareness and making sure that they are reporting these to law enforcement.
Senator Pittman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks again for the extended presentation. I think it's very, very valuable. One thing on the cybersecurity unit, the cyber crimes unit, and I'm going to generalize here, knowing that the cybersecurity unit is not yet in place, right? The one, and then the cyber crime unit is the one in place with 6 individuals. And I do recall putting the money in there, and I'm really appreciative that we were able to do that. The number's a little low still. I know we were just getting started, so I'm excited about where that's going to go. Do you think, we know we just had a cybersecurity task force. I believe you participated somewhat in that, right? Or the KBI came in and at least talked to that group in some fashion or form?
I'm not sure. I know that on one of the task forces we did recently assign somebody to that. I don't know how much involvement they've had quite yet.
I'm going to encourage the KBI to get involved. I'm going to encourage the chairman of that particular committee to get you more involved with that, because we just came out with an initial results out of that task force that we need to incorporate a little bit more of this into it. Because I was going to ask you if you felt like your opinion was, I don't remember there being anything around this inside of the task force recommendations, and I might just not be recalling it. So I think we need to make sure we dial you back into that process a little bit and bring in your recommendations as well. The other thing is, and one of the primary things is, I don't think we really captured inside of the task force how to capture forensic evidence for crimes, cyber crimes, to be investigated. And that seems very critical to me, to figure out a standardized process or a better practice across at least the state agencies and maybe the units of government and maybe businesses, of how we can better capture those things, if there are some possibilities there, to help those folks understand what they need to be capturing and make sure they're capturing it in the context of a criminal prosecution. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I appreciate that, Senator Pittman. You're absolutely right. The only way to investigate, or one of the important pieces to investigation, is to have that evidence. And so we need to capture that evidence, and early awareness of those incidents is critical to that, because that's what's going to allow us to get in there and hopefully find that evidence and retain it versus losing it over time. And so you're right. We do need to improve in our education with the community on that, as well as make that a point to address as well.
Yeah, I mean, I like to go a little step further and make sure it's in the state's protocols and strategies and inside their processes that enforce that, not just educate, but really enforce it in some fashion. The other thing I would ask is when the citizenry, we've got a lot of citizens out there, and the task force focused mainly on entities like business, government, and these types of things, but we have a vast amount of citizenry that are affected by these cyber crimes as well. When they want to make a report like you're asking them to do, where do they go to report that so we can kind of publicize that out? What's their step if they feel like, let's say they've just gotten scammed out of $1,000 they sent over to some Canadian bank account, and now we can't get to it via, either emails or phone calls and things like that. Where do they report that information so that you can track that?
There are a couple of different locations. The IC3 website that I mentioned earlier is the first step, I believe, through the FBI, because that is a law enforcement agency and you are reporting that. The FCC also has the ability to take that information down. We actually just dealt with this earlier last week, and I thought if it's fraud related to unemployment, things like that, the Labor Department website also has the ability to report some of those things. So there are different avenues out there. The most important thing is actually to make a police report, though. If they've
Local police report?
Yes.
Or online KBI, FBI report?
Well, the online IC3 is the FBI one, but a local police report is critical as well.
Is there any chance that you guys could maybe get some websites and maybe send them out to the committee later on, just so then we could publicize those things out? Would that be possible?
That's certainly something we could look at, and
Whatever the link is for just simply the FCC and the IC3 websites and maybe the KDO, the Department of Labor websites and then we could maybe just post that out there.
certainly.
If you want to get that to Connie, she can get it out to the rest of us on. Thank you. Representative Baker?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I guess what I'm missing is when we catch these villains, I never see any names in the paper of people that got strung up by their thumbs or anything. So I obviously the deterrent isn't there because this crime is growing exponentially. So I would like to know if there's somewhere where we can go and see who all these convicted people are.
That's a good question. I don't know of a location to find specific names of people who are being convicted of these things.
So I guess the point is there's no deterrent, really. They're not getting their name in the paper, and a lot of times that's usually about the only deterrent, and I'm not seeing that.
Yeah, I mean, if we're looking at a criminal conviction to what they're doing, there's going to be deterrent factors there with whether it's a financial or incarceration, depending on what they're doing and the extent of what they're doing. If you think about the types of cyber activity that occurs, it's wide ranging, and so things that may not be relatively observant in the news may have a cyber crimes connection to them, but they just don't appear that way. And so I think that going back to the criminal justice system, the criminal investigation and the prosecution of these individuals is the key factor there.
Maybe take their cell phone away from them or something.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yep. I know I'm running low on time. I want to try and hurry up here. I just want to bring up the next section, which is the civil unrest. Kind of going back to what we discussed with the George Floyd death. After that death, we saw a lot of demonstrations around the country, some violent, some not. There weren't any in Kansas that really became violent. But the bigger issue is the discussions that started happening around the country regarding police reform, the police use of force, discussions that in many states created legislation regarding that effect. So, and this body itself created the Kansas Criminal Justice Reform Commission in 2020, and they are doing great work. The governor established the Racial Equity and Justice Commission, and so It is continuing as a topic and an issue that our legislatures and our communities and citizens want to know about. Police reform continues to be an ongoing topic of discussion. As such, the KBI began paying attention to the conversations going on nationally, and we do believe that there should be transparency in this policing environment, and it is incredibly important for that. So as such, we worked with the Attorney General and cooperatively and collaboratively with local law enforcement to start creating a use of force repository that we will have here in Kansas. This is a new endeavor. We're developing it right now. This use of force repository will be used to collect information regarding every use of force incident that occurs in Kansas. This information will be submitted to the KBI by law enforcement in a voluntary setting. We do believe that most of them will participate, if not all of them, because I think the law enforcement community understands and believes that this is an important endeavor. And through our existing Kyber system, they will already go ahead, which they already use. They will be able to load use of force data through that. That data will then be retained in this repository. It's a newly built repository. But more importantly, we will create a public-facing website that the public can go to and look at this aggregate anonymized data across the state and see exactly what use of force is being done. And this, I should mention that this is not just use of force by law enforcement, but it's also use of force used against law enforcement as well. So we'll have a really rounded picture of what type of force is being used here in Kansas. This project should be completed by the end of the year, end of the calendar year, with data collection starting in January, the first quarter of 2022. We were able to do this with no additional funding requests from the legislature, and we believe from our feedback from our stakeholders and others that this is going to be well received. And we hope that this will be used as a resource for researchers, policymakers, legislators, whoever else may want to know about types of force being used in Kansas. So.
Representative Ruiz.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Great presentation, good information. And I noticed you brought up the George Floyd situation and how you're being cognizant of chatter around the country. What about the insurrection attempts where we saw different things happening and law enforcement being threatened and beat? What are you guys hearing about that?
Well, again, I think that our efforts are, I think it's important to bolster our ability to identify those situations. Again, we didn't see any of that violence that may have been seen in other parts of the country here in Kansas. Very peaceful demonstrations occurred. Our intelligence gathering abilities is based on criminal intelligence gathering, and so we're very cognizant of an individual's ability and constitutional right to demonstrate. And so I don't think that we had any direct plans to address those types of situations. However, I think that also goes back to our point of surge capacity. When those situations arise and our ability and our need to dedicate resources and manpower to those situations, that's an area or a deficiency within the KBI right now, and we need to build that. And so I think that it's a very good point. We didn't really experience the need to do that to any nth degree or extent over the last year, but that doesn't mean it won't occur in the future. Speaking of criminal intelligence, we'll kind of move through these last few real quick. The KBI we do have an arm of our KBI that through our Special Operations Division that focuses on criminal intelligence collection. And we are focused on that criminal intelligence collection while our state fusion center is focused on national security threats and issues along that. These two groups work very closely together, and that's great that we have that intelligence gathering ability here in Kansas. The one thing that we do see as a gap in that, and it's a critical gap, is the communication between those intelligence gathering groups and our local law enforcement that are on the street dealing with these incidences directly. So again, one of our enhancement or future requests will involve the creation of a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week operations center to address intelligence. And it will be an intelligence unit or intelligence center that is manned. It will involve collaborative work between federal, state, and local law enforcement and tribal law enforcement here in Kansas. The one thing that I think is beneficial to this group is that, you know, when an officer pulls a car over at 2 o'clock in the morning and they're running the license plate, they're running driver's licenses to see who these individuals are, this intelligence group will be able to give them everything that they need to know about the occupants of that car. And that's an officer safety issue. I mean, there's a lot of things that go along with that. So it's a very critical group and a function of the KBI that we would like to see enhanced. We didn't talk a lot about property crime, and I'll go through it relatively quickly. The big thing is that it did fall in Kansas in 2020. It was at 7.4%, and although our thefts fell, our catalytic converters have been increasing. The thefts of catalytic converters have been increasing over the last year. Catalytic converters, this issue is really being focused on larger communities with that, at least that's what we're seeing, is that they're being hit pretty hard by these catalytic converter thefts. Catalytic converters contain 3 precious metals within them, rhodium, palladium, and platinum. Those metals are being sold to scrap metal dealers for a considerable amount. They're being stolen off of vehicles, and it's pretty expensive to replace catalytic converters on a vehicle. And unfortunately, what they're seeing around the state is that groups of businesses are getting multiple vehicles hit, fleet vehicles hit all at once, and having multiple catalytic converters stolen. And one other downside to, or deterrent to our investigation of this, to law enforcement's investigation of this, is the fact that there's no unique serial numbers on a catalytic converter. So there's no identifying marks that we could put into a system that if somebody were to try and sell, it would cause a red flag. And so we're working, many of you remember our scrap metal repository. You helped fund it and create it. And so we are really focused on addressing the catalytic converter issue with our scrap metal repository. In the last, that repository began in 2020. And since its inception, we have 104 scrap metal dealers around the state that have been registered through it. Only 61 of those are actually reporting transactions to the KBI. But within our repository, we have 113 transactions and over 2 million items of scrap metal that have been sold since 2020. Of those 2 million, 6,000, a little bit over 6,000 catalytic converters are in there, so our transactions are in there. Currently, we are working to improve our operations of our scrap metal repository and trying to work collaboratively with local law enforcement to make sure that we can pass that information down to them and to help reduce the theft of scrap metal and specifically catalytic converters. I wanted to touch on license plate readers real quick. This committee had asked us to offer some thoughts on license plate readers. I think it's important to note, or at least I want to mention, that the KBI does not own or utilize or deploy any LPR cameras. We don't own any. We don't retain any of that data, and we do use it, but we don't retain any of it in-house. Most of those LPR data or LPR cameras are sold by individual companies. A lot of them have proprietary rights to their software on them that they will give to local law enforcement and other law enforcement agencies that use those. But I do want to mention that I think it is important, and the use of LPR data is beneficial. It's beneficial to the investigation of violent crimes, whether that's a murder suspect that has fled the state, and we can use LPR data to kind of track their direction of travel, human trafficking cases, drug trafficking cases, which you've already mentioned, and the swift resolution of amber and silver alerts. LPR data is in many of these situations, law enforcement is getting into those situations already behind the time. I mean, because, you know, from the minute it happens, we're already late getting there. So once it's made to, notifications made to us, this LPR data is incredibly important for us to be able to start narrowing our focus of which way we need to be looking. And Amber Alerts is a prime example of that. But I will say, in talking about LPR data, although it is beneficial and it does help with exigent circumstances and issues with public safety, it needs to be used appropriately and responsibly, and that's the key to it. And so I just want to make that point. I know that there were some questions on a FOIA request, but I'm not sure what that FOIA request is, but that's kind of, I did want to offer those opinions as far as LPR data and our use of LPR data. Okay. Finally, I just want to touch on is the issue of recruitment. When we talk about recruitment, whether it's the need for surge capacity, the need for additional people for crimes against children or violent crime, one of the things that law enforcement across the state and across the country is dealing with, and we are no exception as far as the KBI, is our ability to recruit. We have a real issue with trying to get people in the door. There's been, as we've mentioned, George Floyd, there's been other instances around the country where the spotlight's been turned on law enforcement, and the ability to find these people and recruit professional, ethical folks is becoming harder. A lot of them are hesitant to enter the field because of that spotlight that's on it. But you have to remember, when somebody applies for a position in law enforcement, before they even are offered a job, their background, their social history, their financial history, the decisions that their drug history, everything is scrutinized to the nth degree to make sure that they are a good fit for law enforcement. And so, you know, whether it's polygraphs or anything else, it's a process to get people on board. And we're just having trouble doing it all across criminal justice and specifically in law enforcement. So in order to be able to address this and be able to address these threats to violent crime or these threats to public safety, we have to build our capacity. We have to build our folks, and we can't do that unless we can figure out a way to get and recruit and retain the people that we have. So I'm hoping that the legislature will would support a measure by law enforcement to improve our ability to recruit in the next coming year or years, because I think it's a critical piece. It directly affects and impacts public safety, and I think that that's what we need to do first before we can start looking at building our capacity. So in summary, I just want to mention that the KBI has that continuing significant concern over public safety in our state. We have an increase in violent crime and gun violence, as we mentioned, 48.5%. We have unfortunately continued physical and sexual assault of children, which need to end, obviously. The distribution of illicit drugs through the state is a concern, and the violence and property crime and violent crime that goes along with that is a concern. And the cyber attacks that occur to Kansas and cyber criminals victimizing the people in Kansas, and that again is a concern. With that, I will wrap up. I know I'm probably a little bit over on time, and I apologize, but I'd be happy to stand for questions.
All right, Representative Ruiz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Great presentation. And do you have a career opportunity website that you can send to Connie as well, that we can, I have organizations in my area in Kansas City, Kansas, that I would like to opportunity for them to join, I'd like to see that opportunity be presented to them.
I'll certainly look into that, yes.
Perfect, thank you.
Other questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a line of questions, if that's okay.
Sure.
And thank you for the presentation. This is one of the reasons I really enjoy being on this committee, because it impacts so many other committees. And that being said, can I make a request that Connie share this information that's been presented here today to the Child Welfare Oversight Committee? I had just brought up that KBI was understaffed in their children's crimes unit, and just the last time I was there, I'd known that from the past from Katie's presentations. I guess the most important question I have is, would your enhancement request from 2020 still be ample today? Or would you increase that enhancement?
I think that as far as, would that same amount be equal today? Honestly, I probably couldn't answer that today. We could certainly get that information for you, whether that would be increased or would suffice for today. My guess is based on just the cost of everything, it might go up a little bit, but we would certainly look into that and get you that information.
I ask that because this committee's tasked with giving a report to the legislature as a whole, and this is an important presentation to back up the need for that enhancement request. Thank you for your work. And the link, I appreciate having the link to the Houston Chiefs statement on sensible gun policies. The anonymous kits that you brought up that you hold for 5 years, you said they're not tested. Is that still true today with the Psaki efforts?
Yes, there's no way, I mean, we can test them. The problem is that we have no one to report that back to because they are anonymous kits. We don't know where we know we receive them from the hospital, but just because, let's say a victim goes into Stormont Vale and has a kit done, that doesn't mean that the crime actually occurred in Topeka. So there's no way to get that information and those results back to either local law enforcement or anyone else. And so those kits are held until a law enforcement report is done, and then we take that kit off the shelf and work it and then report those results back.
I only ask because I'm thinking in a situation of like a serial rapist, that if we knew that that DNA matched this anonymous kit and there was a conviction made, then they could be convicted of the multiple incidents instead of whatever the one conviction may be. I don't know if that's a possibility if we had the capacity, but that came to mind. Your gun violence numbers, those don't include suicide, right? Suicide isn't a crime?
I do not believe that they do.
Okay. So that number of deaths due to gun violence would expand beyond the homicide numbers. I just wanted to clarify that. You mentioned the Children's Victim Unit. How many members are on that CVU?
I don't want to say for certain. I think it's approximately 6.
I think that was what, when Ms. Wisman was in your place, she compared that to Oklahoma in one of the presentations here, and I think Oklahoma had like 9 or 12 for a similar sized population, and it seemed like we were pretty grossly understaffed in that area. So I appreciate the enhancement request to build up that staff, because my work on child welfare, I know the need. And then you'd mentioned the highways, you know, is part of drug trafficking, and I know that's also human trafficking. And you didn't touch on that. Is human trafficking still on an increase in the state of Kansas?
Human trafficking, I kind of moved through the presentation at the end, and I apologize, but human trafficking, hate crimes, and outlaw motorcycle gangs, a lot of those threats continue, and they are rising to some degree. We, in Kansas, especially with hate crimes specifically, and I don't want to skip the human trafficking, but there was the KBI itself did not participate in the investigation of hate crimes in Kansas during 2020. There are some that were reported, but those were handled by the local law enforcement and were able to be handled just appropriately that way. So we didn't really have a lot to report to you on hate crimes. Human trafficking does continue in Kansas. There have been operations throughout the state to fight that and to identify those individuals. Some up here in the Northeast, as a matter of fact. And so we can get you additional detail on human trafficking if you would like, specific figures and numbers for 2020. But it does continue to be a problem and a threat to public safety, clearly.
If you have additional materials or information, I'd sure like to see it in the hate crimes as well. Thank you for bringing that up. I know nationwide that's been on the rise. So, yeah, I'd be happy to see whatever. And then my final question, if I may, Mr. Chair. When you were talking about marijuana, we're between Missouri and Colorado. Has there been any significance to decriminalization and lowering of violent crime in the state? Is there any information?
Kansas or in Missouri?
In Missouri, in states that have decriminalized or even just medicinal. Is there any correlation noted?
That's a very good question. I didn't look at those figures, but that's certainly something I can look into specifically for Missouri, Oklahoma, and see what the level of violent crime was before they decriminalized marijuana versus or added medicinal marijuana versus what it is now.
I know as we have those discussions in our separate chambers, that'd be useful information, and I've not been privy to any of it on any committee I sit on. So if you can enlighten me, I'd much appreciate it.
It's a great question, yes.
Thank you for being here, and thank you for answering my questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative. Senator Peck?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Do appreciate your presentation, most of it, and provide a lot of good information. However, before I get to my however, just a few seconds, 8 to 10 years ago, I invested a lot of time and energy in making certain that Washburn University got a new lab for the KBI. So I'm very supportive and known as someone who supports law enforcement. So I just wanted to set that up for you. On page 1, back to the however, on page 1 of your presentation, you quote or cite an article in the New York Times. At least one member of this committee, several other legislators, and many in the general public do not have a trust of the news media and do not believe that everything that they write is reliable. As a matter of fact, a low percentage of it is considered reliable by some of us. But you cite the New York Times article as it relates to violent crime, and in here you say that in the article they surmise, and just briefly the word surmise, according to definitions, is suppose that something is true without having evidence to confirm it. And then you go on to talk about the violent crime and the causes of violent crime. And you talk about the fact of increased number of people carrying firearms, which of course I believe that the New York Times would not support our Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. The reason I even bring this up is by you citing this, you give credence to this article, to my way of thinking, and to many others, because they can look at this testimony and say, well, the Kansas Bureau of Investigation said this as it being fact, when indeed it is a surmising of some information or a belief by a particular writer and an editor. And then on page 2, you quote the number of homicides in the state of Kansas. I'm confident that the Kansas Bureau of Investigation has records and can provide statistics, but when you quote that, there is a footnote, number 4, and that's the white and gray minimalist annual report, which I do not believe would be a KBI report, or maybe it is. But my point is I would urge the KBI to provide their own information that we can count on as being accurate. And I'm not saying that what you provide is not accurate, sir. I'm just saying that when you cite some of these other things, it causes a little bit of a question mark in the minds of some. And you talk about the distrust of law enforcement, and some of us have zero distrust of law enforcement. We have complete trust of law enforcement. I have no concern that if I'm pulled over or if I see a law enforcement officer, that there's going to be any incident, because number one, I trust the officer. Number two, I'm going to comply with the officer's commands or request. And that's generally where the problem comes in, is when a person does not comply with the request. So I suppose I would have one question, and that would be, rather than citing these other entities for your information, could you not provide information that is strictly put together by the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, and then that other just take it for what it's worth as far as when you're making presentations?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Senator. I appreciate those comments. And I do appreciate that. One thing I will tell you is on that white and gray quote or the reference, I saw that as well. I'm not exactly sure why that comes up that way, but that was directly from the KBI website. And so that is those crime index numbers, the level of crime in Kansas and those statistics are from our website directly, and they are in our crime index report. So, but you're right. I don't know why it came up that way. I saw that too, and I'm not sure why I did that. In fact, I tried 2 or 3 different ways to change that, but it is directly from the KBI source.
I appreciate that information, but again, I want whatever the information provided by the Kansas Bureau of Investigation to not be questioned by legislators or the general public. So maybe you'd say that was a harsh criticism, and maybe it was, but it's constructive criticism to try to improve the agency.
I do appreciate that, yes.
Senator Pittman?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for the presentation, as I said before. I would say 3 points, basically on the marijuana piece. You know, it kind of was glaring that you focused on the marijuana on one of the slides. I do think there's at least some push to legalize marijuana, at least for medicinal purposes. And so I do hope the KBI and the KHP have strategies and work with us to figure out, and I know that that's happening to a degree, but to look at it just as a source of violence, I think that we have to think about the times in our neighboring states. And I'm just urging us to continue to think about the strategies we're going to have if this were to happen. And I'm sure there are strategies out there that you guys are thinking about, but I want to put that out there as a recommendation. The other thing on the use of force, I commend you on that as well. The senator mentioned that when he gets stopped, or if he were to get stopped, he would be compliant. Some folks do get profiled out there, whether we believe it or not. I do believe that's a true fact. And some people don't have the advantage that we might have based on color, skin, or other characteristics, economic status, or whatever. So that we do know that there is distrust out there, and so we have to continue to be the force of integrity. And I think this use of force repository is at least a step in the right direction. And I do commend you on that, because we do want to fight anything that would jeopardize that ability to comply and do the right thing in that circumstance because some prejudice or something like that. I'm a little bit concerned that we the KBI, and this is my last point, we have a series of different politically motivated criminal activity, I believe. Whether you're on one side or the other of the abortion issue, there are in Kansas different things where people have been attacked for their beliefs in that regard, in that realm. We know that we just had today, Secretary saying that in New Mexico, his counterpart had to leave the state because of decisions they had or things that were happening in the unemployment system. We know that different people like health officials, county health officials, have been targeted with threats and other things like that. Whether you're pro-COVID vaccines or anti-vaccines, we know that these people are serving the public, and sometimes political appointments. And then there's the individuals like ourselves who are out there. I had a question come to me yesterday, hey, what happens if somebody targets us because we're a representative? Well, we're not a specialized class of citizen. We're just citizens, and we get targeted. But I think that there's a feeling that there's a lot more of that activity, or maybe that's always been like this. And I think the KBI is our resource to help us in that regard. The KHP sits there and they help with threat response, but the KBI is the one that puts the pieces together. It's that higher level thinking of putting the pieces together and look at activists. I'm hoping that there is a lot of focus on that right now, just because of the climate we're in, because of some of the issues that have been coming up over the last couple of years. I'm hoping and I'm recommending that you really take a serious look at that as an activity center. You didn't address it too much today, but I'm worried about the safety of some of my colleagues here. You mentioned one cyber attack. threat that was, taken down from, but there are many, many more, many people that are in that spot right now, school boards, et cetera, who are under duress. And the KBI might be the only entity that can come in and help in that situation. So I hope you focus on that over the next year. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Other questions? Seeing none, thank you for your presentation. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
All right, folks, we had set a time of 11 o'clock for discussion and recommendations. We don't have a deadline. If we have discussions, and nope, it's open. Yeah. The committee want to work through this, or do we want to take lunch and come back? Do you think we have that much work to do, or do you want to try and muddle through this? Recommendations and discussion from the past 2 days' work, or past yesterday's work and today. Senator Cluse? Okay. All right. Very good. All right. No objection. We'll keep working. All right. Well, let's begin. With past, yeah, Representative Baker.
I have a request. Excellent presentation.
Jill Shelley with Legislative Research. They are posted on the committee's website already. Thanks, Connie.
Any recommendations, discussion for what we've heard? Representative Ousley?
I would just make the recommendation that we get the KBI's enhancement request from 2020 to them as quick as we can through the process.
Yes.
So my concern is, while we have funds available right now, now's the time to prioritize the cybersecurity funding for not just the KBI, but for all the presenters that had concerns about their ability to hire staff and do their job properly. I believe we have a 233% increase in cyber crime so far, the first part of this year, and I don't know how you measure that. It's probably every bit of that. But I think we need to get out in front of that and make sure that these things get taken care of as a priority first in this next section.
Would it be the will of the committee if we were to make a suggestion or a recommendation to support any and all cybersecurity requests, reasonable cybersecurity requests through the agencies that we've heard from?
Mr. Chair, if I may.
Absolutely.
I'm hesitant to say any and all. I mean, we need to do it in a coordinated fashion across the state agencies. And I don't want to be a hindrance, but we can't willy-nilly give, KU, I don't know why I'm picking on KU, but KU a bunch of money on cybersecurity. And then somebody else comes out and says, hey, we want to do more cybersecurity over here. And then somebody else does it, and they're not coordinating with the CSO, the Chief Security Officer. I do think, though, the idea, but I'm hesitant just to throw out there and say, hey, we recommend that. All the money they ask for, we just send it to them for cybersecurity. I don't know. It needs to be coordinated somehow, so we're looking at it as a systematic thing,
I did state that in a way that was very generalized. I meant from the entities we had heard from and the proposals that we had heard. Were there any specific, Senator, that you heard in our presentations that you felt were unreasonable requests? And I suppose that's where I would then focus our statement to, is those that we've heard. I'm not sure exactly how we'd word that, but
Could we say, we think we support, increased funding inside of the cybersecurity space, especially from the entities we heard from. And I would like to add on top of that, and that we should seriously consider any recommendations coming out of the Cybersecurity Task Force or the Joint Committee on Technology or this task force around cybersecurity. I don't know. Seriously consider, is that even a recommendation? I think we do need to put some kind of emphasis on it, though.
Well, we have some wordsmiths here who are very good with it. We can, I think they hear what we're trying to piece out here. And if we have an opportunity, we will have an opportunity to see what they come up with, and we can vet that out then. I think generally we have a support for improving our cybersecurity statewide. Senator Peck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am unaware of what the specific request would be. I prefer to see numbers, and I don't serve on Ways and Means. Rather than, and I don't like necessarily the word increase, I prefer adequate or reasonable or something like that as far
Yeah, I do too.
Cybersecurity, because that is an issue that needs to be addressed, but it could be subject to opinion from one agency to another agency that we have heard from. And again, I would like to know the exact enhancement request, because when we use the word enhancement up here, what we're talking about is additional taxpayer dollars going to a government entity, which in some cases, I don't mind giving my taxpayer dollars to. In other cases, it's like, you got to be kidding me. But anyway, so is there some way to get the numbers, I guess would be my question, as far as the request that they have made, whether it's the KBI or any of the others?
So we could go back through what they have, and the PDFs are listed on our committee website. Is that right? Is that where it's at?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Jill Shelley with Legislative Research. But please bear in mind that only those reports made in public session are available on the website or to staff.
Right.
Another way, Mr. Chairman, if I may, would be potentially to direct that the Senate Ways and Means and House Appropriations Committee review the increase in funding requests for cybersecurity. And I don't know exactly what the words would be, but again, I'd not, as I'd mentioned on the KBI thing from 8 to 10 years ago, there were some who thought I opposed it. No, I was just wanting to make certain that we got the proper value for our dollar. I was supportive, but some thought, well, you don't like this idea. No, I do like it. Let's just make sure it's very efficient. So my wife calls me cheap. You can call me what you want to, but when it comes to spending anyone's money, I'm going to be very cautious. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You bet. And I think we all understand the importance. You know, when we're talking about cybersecurity here, it's not just protecting a corporation or one entity, it's protecting the taxpayers out there, right? Their information, we hold that information, and if we don't protect it and due diligence, then we're failing. So we have to be careful that we do that. But I respect what you're trying to say there. We have to be reasonable, and it needs to be with a fiduciary mind how we do it. The way I stated it sounded very generalized, and I certainly wouldn't support it in that manner. So hopefully we can come up with some verbiage that'll work. Representative Ousley?
I appreciate this conversation, but I just don't want the KBI enhancement to get lost in a cybersecurity conversation, because crimes against children are violent, physical acts, and I think we're talking about two separate things here, and I just don't want that recommendation to get lost in cybersecurity discussion.
Very good. Noted. I have some comments that were made yesterday. The intercoms and blue lights on the lowest level of parking. I'm not sure who we make that recommendation to, but there was some discussion about that yesterday. Senator Peterson?
If you exit the parking garage, as you get off the elevators, go through the first set of doors, look to your left, there is a blue light in the call box on the lower level.
On the left.
This one,
Inside the little,
inside the glass.
yeah. Okay. Oh, yeah.
There's other locations, but that's where the one is for our B1 level, the parking garage.
Yeah, they were speaking specifically about that lower level yesterday. Active shooter training for legislative members comes up in almost every one of our discussions. You know, I made mention in 2015, before I was with the legislature, I came up here as an instructor on active shooter to view what they were giving up here at the state capitol as, what can I gain from it? And it was awesome training. It was great training. Unfortunately, there were about 12 people in the old Supreme Court room that got to listen to that presentation, including, I think, one legislator. The other were staff. It's not something that we would be able to mandate, and I wouldn't suggest that we do, but to somehow gain interest, and maybe with this new group of folks, we would have a greater interest. But I wouldn't have any problem with a recommendation that there be an active shooter training for legislators and their staff at some point, coordinated through Capitol Police. What does the committee feel about that? Representative Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe on Security Technology Committee in previous years, didn't we have a presentation from somebody about that? With all and that technology, once again, that's 4 or 5 years ago. I'm sure it's all changed and been enhanced quite a bit. We might want to review some of our past records and see who that presenter was, because he did a good job. I think he's from Kansas City, Missouri, as I recall.
We could do that. Captain Dean actually was the lieutenant at that time, and he had one of his members who does that as a regular. They have training. There's specific training to that I think that we may be able to get through our own resources. But we could ask them what they have available now. Senator Peterson?
I would support a recommendation that would have active shooter training be made available to the legislators. They can sort out who it comes from. I know this committee itself several years back had some pretty good presentations on the issue.
Very good. Do we need to take that as a motion? How would we do that? Why don't we move it as a motion? Do I have a second on that? Then we can have discussion. All right, we have a motion and a second. Is there a discussion? Senator Peck, did you have something?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This would be, what I would urge would be something along the lines of a fire drill. And that might be something we want to add in, because if there is an emergency inside the Capitol building, legislators need to know when to stay in the building and when to exit the building. We did one time have a small fire a few years ago of some sort. There was smoke or something, and all legislators and staff exited the building. But I think we fall down a lot of times in our duty for safety of legislators and legislative staff, because we really don't know where we're to go when there is an emergency to exit, when there's an emergency to stay in place. So I don't know if we want to make a recommendation that not only active shooter, but others as well, similar, like I say, to a fire drill or tornado drill or whatever we want to.
Some type of emergency response training.
Yes, sir.
Well, I think that there's two things. There's training, which is kind of the session inside the Supreme Court room that you talked about, and then there's the drill. I think those are two separate things. I think we should recommend both. I don't know if they'll happen or not, but I think we should have a drill practice, and then we should have the training before that so people know what's going on.
Right. Senator Ware?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There was also some talk about including the staff, the sergeant-at-arms in both chambers with at least parts of this training could be very helpful for them.
Very good. I think when they had it, I'm going to say it was 2015, it may have been 2016. When they had it then, I'm not sure how they scheduled it. And there was some talk about the reason why it was so minimally attended was because of the timing. So that would be something that would be, I'm sure, that'd be difficult to work with. But as far as a drill goes, I'm not sure that we're going to be able to get the legislature to work through a drill. The ones I've observed before, anyhow.
To make it As a recommendation, I don't know if we're going to actually get it done, though. I think Senator Peck is on it. I'll call him Senator. I don't know what his wife calls him, but I'll call him Senator. What I just would like to make it as a recommendation, knowing that it might not happen.
Okay. Senator Peterson.
In case I didn't hear, the recommendation was that active shooter training be made available, or the motion be made available to the legislature. They said it was hard to hear on the internet, so just wanted to make sure that was clear. And staff.
Do we want to change that language then to some emergency response training to include active shooter? Would you be interested in amending your motion to that? And my substitute motion would be an emergency response training orientation for legislature and their staff to include active shooter training. And a second. All right. Any more discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right. We have a recommendation. All right. I wrote down some things. They were talking about electronic access areas. Trying to determine if this should be. Let me get a second opinion.
Can I go ahead and make a motion on another thing that you were talking about?
Sure.
Yeah, I'm just going to make a motion that we have the Capitol Police assess the safety, security, of the bottom parking lot level. We do have one blue light. I just want them to do an assessment of whether it's adequate or not for the entire garage, given that there's no cell phone access throughout the whole area. So I just make a recommendation that they do an
Security assessment of
security
the
assessment
lower level.
of the lower level garage.
Is that a motion then? Do I have a second? I have a second. Discussion. Okay, so the motion is for Capitol Police to do a security assessment of the lower level of parking lot, parking garage to determine whether it's adequate, security measures are adequate. I have a motion and a second. Any other discussion? Representative Baker. Almost promoted you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So part of the heartburn on that is there's some legislators that work late at night, and going down that parking garage late at night, I've had several of them express concern to me. 9:30, 10 o'clock at night, they go down there, and that's a pretty big area that's pretty quiet, and they feel somewhat vulnerable. So I think that's something we ought to assess.
Any other discussion? All in favor? Say aye. All opposed? All right, another recommendation. Senator Peterson.
We heard a lot about cybersecurity. I don't know if this would be in our bailiwick, but I think we might ought to see if we could have the legislature look at the penalties. Right now, a lot of fraud and identity theft, except for unemployment fraud, is low-level non-person felony. So that means that unless you have a couple person felonies along with you, it's presumptive probation for up to $100,000 of theft. Maybe that's the cause of why we had such a target on us. Maybe we ought to ask our judiciary committees to take a look at the penalties for fraud and identity theft. It's thrown out for discussion.
I'm trying to think of the wording that would capture all of that, because I think it all could be reviewed for severity. So is the recommendation just for them to review, make recommendations on increasing the penalty?
They can tell whether it's necessary or not.
Other discussion? So the motion is for the Judiciary Committee to review Um,
I recommend the Judiciary Committee review the penalties as it's related to identity theft and fraud.
Identity theft and fraud. I'd second that. Other discussion? All in favor? Opposed? Accepted. Senator Pittman.
I'm going to make two motions. First one would just be that, I think it's going to happen, but I want to make, urge the KBI to get involved with the Cybersecurity Task Force and emphasize the kind of the forensic requirements that they would need to kind of put in place for cybersecurity crimes. Basically, I want that in knowledge to be pushed into that Cybersecurity Task Force and them to be a part of that conversation. So we're looking at how do we capture evidence so that we can enhance the prosecutions of cybersecurity attacks.
So this is what you were discussing with him. Okay. Restate it for me. I'm kind of muddled on it.
KBI gets involved with the Cybersecurity Task Force, and among other things, enhance the knowledge for state agencies of what information and procedures they should be using to get better criminal prosecution rates in cybersecurity attacks. Something like that. I think they're going to do it already, but we might as well come up with the recommendation.
You're talking about
I want them to capture the right information at the right time and make sure all the state entities are doing the processes that are going to allow them to have enhanced prosecution chances. Sometimes they don't have the right information available.
so I'll take that as a motion. Is there a second on this? Representative Ruiz, and discussion. I think that what you're talking about then is for them to be involved with the current cybersecurity task force, that they would be able to provide for them a protocol of retaining information for evidentiary purpose, right?
Yeah, that's a lot better.
Well,
yes.
I think in a nutshell.
Mm-hmm.
And I would invite the director of KBI, Dr. Thompson. Does that sound like a protocol that would be useful or that could be devised by the KBI?
I think it can be, and we already have many of those in place. When our new cyber squad goes out to work cases, one of the first things that they try to do is pass along information to the agency they're assisting about how to collect, what to collect, and how to stop any further damage to their systems. That's kind of job one when we respond. So I think that's doable, and we'd be happy to share those protocols.
Awesome. It's something I would support. So we have a motion and a second. Any other discussion? Seeing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Received.
I was going to make a second motion, something around, I don't know, I just feel like it could come out as a recommendation, maybe the body doesn't want to, but something that's, we have a number of, like I said before, political public servants that could be or are under duress, and I'm not sure how to make a motion here, but I'd like to further assess the situation from a security perspective of what we as a state could be doing to help them in their situation. I don't have a really good answer here other than I think the KBI should take a harder look at that, but they were already doing a lot, and these have to do with elected officials, people who are making political decisions and get a lot of grief from the community about it and potentially are being threatened and forced to move out of their homes. I don't know what can be done there, but I just think that we should have some kind of focus on this because it seems like it's a growing issue. So I don't know what my motion would be there, and I don't know if the committee has any thoughts on whether we even want to make that as a recommendation or an observation, but I think it's out there.
I'm trying to wordsmith it in my mind. I think I understand what you're trying to say, and it would be a security, a threat assessment. I'm not sure how they would go about that or what we would ask them to do on that specifically.
That was what I was having a challenge with. I don't know if anybody else had any thoughts, and maybe we don't do it, but maybe there are some thoughts.
Representative Baker?
So I guess one of the questions I have is the KBI working with local officials on some of these type issues with security with local public servants?
Director Thompson?
Thanks for the question. Yes, we are. Generally, the way our system is established is crime occurs in the local communities. So crime is reported at the local level to police departments and sheriff's offices. At the point that there's a belief that maybe it's more extensive than they have the capacity to work, or it goes outside and goes to another jurisdiction, they normally pass that information to us. So on the law enforcement side, we're pretty good. Where we struggle a bit is with citizen complaints, with citizen information about criminal activity. And so we've developed some systems for citizen reporting to our organization. And sometimes we hear about the kind of events that you're talking about. Many times we don't. But I don't have an answer for you just right off the top of my head. If you would like us to try to assess something, come back to the committee, we would be happy to do that. I just don't see an immediate solution.
What do you hear from other states? We're not unique. A lot of these issues we discuss, we're not the only state going through this. What do you hear from your counterparts?
Many of our counterparts are in areas that have a great deal of civil activity at this point in time, and we aren't experiencing that same kind of pushback, if you will. In looking at just our hate crime information, Kansas doesn't report through law enforcement channels much of that. Maybe there's an issue or a response back to Senator Peck, and that is we do try to use information that's available to us, the use of force reporting system, those kinds of things. We're trying to develop systems that deal with Kansas issues, Kansas problems. To be honest with you, I'm tired of hearing the news, the news saying California is doing this or New York is doing that. So it's interpreted that those same kind of things are occurring in Kansas, where I really don't think that is the case. I don't know how to answer the question about what other states are doing, because I'm not seeing really any other states similarly situated like Kansas. I mean, we all have legislators, we all have other public officials who may be threatened or feel pressured. But I don't know how to answer your question.
I wonder, Director, part of the problem here would be quantifying by certain demographic, right? Because we don't report it as, if I took a report of a representative receiving threatening phone call, for instance, I'm not reporting that to KBI as, hey, I have a state representative who was threatened. What I report to them is I have an assault or a criminal threat. That's what I report. It's not necessarily about a political. Now, in my report, my actual narrative, it'll be there. They're not looking at that unless I ask them to. If I ask them to look at that, then that happens. So for them to be able to quantify, I think, is going to be difficult for the KBI themselves. So it would be, and here's why I was having trouble with it, it would be more or less a training item for law enforcement. But you're talking about something that would probably encompass, one, you'd have to train the individual officers who are taking the report, but also the reporting agency itself and how it captures its data in order to be able to quantify it. I think that's the issue. Director, does that make sense?
Yes, I think the other part of this, and I didn't maybe complete my explanation, is law enforcement knows how to roll those situations up to us, and we're trying to work on ways for citizens to be able to roll those issues up to us. We get reports from law enforcement about telephone threats, those kinds of things against public officials, and ask for assistance, and we can do them. If there's a report made to Capitol Police, those kinds of things are passed along. There's just not a formalized, if this situation occurs, this is a formalized reporting process. I think we get most of it, but I can't ever be certain.
There's not enough here to really put in as a recommendation. I don't know. It's just something that we're seeing, and we're seeing it across the board on a lot of different local levels. I think it's something that our citizens are experiencing, and it's a sad thing when people are stepping up for service and then they feel threatened like they are. And I understand there are many different passionate issues, and we all have that right to have those different sides. It's when it comes into physical violence and threats and actual, sometimes homicide, in certain cases where it gets extreme, that it's really tragic, and we just got to keep our eye out there that shouldn't be happening in Kansas.
Thank you, Senator. Other recommendations? Senator Peck?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This wouldn't fall under the category of recommendation, but I asked some questions of the Secretary of State's office yesterday, and I apologize. I don't remember if it was in closed session or open session, but I would like to get the answers to those questions, and I don't feel like I should have to call them and say, hey, you're going to answer my questions type of a thing. Was that in closed or open session, do you? If it was an open session, then I would just ask staff to contact the Secretary of State's office and say, Senator Peck asked a question of Mr. McCaskey, and we'd like to have the answers. If not, then staff, it wouldn't really be their responsibility.
Yeah, I believe it was an open session. The entire thing was open.
Okay, and I have no problem with the rest of the committee receiving that information if they need or want it, but it bothered me. I guess I thought I would get those answers post haste just shortly after they left the room, but they hadn't, and they haven't.
All right, on that recommendation, it is a recommendation that the questions be answered.
Sounds like it's a request of research.
If you could share that with the committee, if you would get them an email specific to the questions, and we could have that shared to the committee. I think that's simple enough. Other discussion or recommendations? Well, seeing none, I think that concludes our work, folks. Our staff has been really great about putting together a report in a timely fashion. When we get that report, we'll get a draft that we'll be able to take a look at and make corrections to or recommendations from individually. Just make sure you get that back to them. They'll have the path that you need to follow in order to get those recommendations to them. And then they have a requirement to have that before the end of the year, but I think they try to push before the end of November, I think is what they're trying to, yeah, that's the hope. Thank you all for being here in person. Thank you for your contribution to this. It is important work, and a lot of things that we had to listen, had to hear this time, I think, help us develop a broader picture of where we are, where we stand security-wise. And when we hear our colleagues talking about various things they're seeing in the committees, we have this background knowledge that we can use to help them make decisions or understand why they're hearing what they're hearing. And I think that's probably the biggest piece of our work, is just having that knowledge that we can help them with. So anyway, if there's nothing else for the committee, we're adjourned. Thank you, Louis. Appreciate it. Unless something comes up. I can't.